The first dawn of 2023 broke over Cohasset, Massachusetts, with an eerie stillness. While most Americans were nursing hangovers or making resolutions, a different kind of awakening was taking place in a quiet residential neighborhood. Anna Walshe, a 39-year-old real estate manager and mother of 3 young boys, had vanished from her home. No goodbye note, no frantic call, no trace whatsoever. But the silence would not last long. Within hours, digital breadcrumbs began appearing on her husband's devices. Breadcrumbs that would horrify investigators and captivate the nation. Questions typed into search engines in the dead of night, purchases made at pharmacies and hardware stores, surveillance footage showing a man making trips to dumpsters and waste facilities, and at the center of it all stood Brian Walshe, husband, father, and soon to be the defendant in one of the most scrutinized missing person cases in recent American history. This was a case with no body, no crime scene confession, and no eyewitness to any act of violence. Yet the story it told, through fragments of evidence, would raise fundamental questions about truth, reasonable doubt, and what happens when a marriage ends, not with divorce papers but with disappearance. Anna Walshe was born and raised in Belgrade, Serbia, a world away from the coastal Massachusetts town where her life would intersect with tragedy. She had built a career in real estate management, navigating the competitive American market with the determination of someone who had crossed an ocean to create a new life. Friends and colleagues would later describe her as organized, ambitious, and devoted to her 3 sons. Her husband Brian Walshe came from a different background, but carried his own complexities. Before Anna's disappearance thrust him into the national spotlight, Brian had already encountered the federal justice system. He had pleaded guilty to charges of art fraud involving fake Andy Warhol paintings, a scheme that revealed a man comfortable operating in shadows and deception. When Anna vanished on January 1, 2023, Brian was awaiting sentencing in that fraud case, his freedom hanging by a legal thread. The couple lived in Cohasset, a picturesque coastal town south of Boston, known for its rocky shores, historic charm, and the kind of New England tranquility that appears on postcards. It was the last place anyone would expect a disappearance that would grip the nation. Population around 8,000, median household income well above the national average. The sort of community where neighbors know each other and trust still exists. The juxtaposition between setting and alleged crime would become one of the haunting elements of this case. The question that investigators, journalists, and eventually jurors would grapple with was deceptively simple. When was Anna Walshe last seen alive and by whom? The evening of December 31, 2022 was unremarkable in many ways. It was New Year's Eve, a time for celebration, reflection, and hope for the year ahead. According to witness statements, Anna and Brian attended a party with friends. Multiple people would later testify that they saw the couple together interacting seemingly normal. These witnesses represent the last confirmed sightings of Anna Walshe alive. What happened after the party ended and the couple returned home remains the subject of fierce legal dispute. The prosecution and defense would construct entirely different narratives from the same starting point, like architects looking at the same plot of land and envisioning radically different structures. According to prosecutors, the morning of January 1, 2023 marked not just a new year, but the beginning of an elaborate cover-up. They alleged that Brian Walshe engaged in a series of calculated actions that painted a damning picture. Store surveillance cameras allegedly captured him visiting CVS, Walgreens, and Lowe's, purchasing items that prosecutors described as a murderer's shopping list, hydrogen peroxide in bulk quantities, ammonia, Tyvek, protective suits of the kind used in hazardous material, handling knives, saws, and various cleaning supplies. But it was what investigators found on Brian's digital devices that would become some of the most chilling evidence presented at trial. Internet search histories allegedly revealed queries that read like a macabre instruction manual. Questions about when human bodies begin to emit odors, how-to searches about dismemberment, inquiries about the best methods for disposing of remains. The timestamps on these searches, prosecutors argued, were crucial. They allegedly occurred in the hours and days immediately following Anna's disappearance, suggesting premeditation or at minimum immediate consciousness of guilt. Yet Brian's initial story to authorities painted an entirely different picture. He told investigators that Anna had left their Cohasset home on January 1st to travel to Washington, D.C. for work obligations. According to his account, she had taken a rideshare to the airport and flew to the nation's capital. He claimed he had not been immediately concerned when he did not hear from her, assuming she was busy with professional responsibilities. The problem with this narrative became apparent almost immediately. Investigators could find no record of Anna ordering a rideshare. No Uber receipt, no Lyft ride, no taxi company log. Airport surveillance and airline manifests showed no evidence of Anna Walshe boarding any flight to Washington, D.C., or anywhere else. Her phone, which had been active on December 31st, went completely dark on January 1st. No calls, no texts, no data usage. Her credit cards and bank accounts showed no activity. For a woman who worked in real estate and managed properties, this sudden communications blackout was anomalous. It was not Brian who reported Anna missing. That detail would become significant in the prosecution's narrative. On January the 4th, 2023, 3 days after she had allegedly left for Washington, Anna's employer and colleagues began making inquiries. Where was she? Why had she not shown up for scheduled appointments? Why were her calls going unanswered? It was these professional contacts who ultimately pushed for a missing person report to be filed with the Cohasset Police Department. When questioned about the delay in reporting, Brian allegedly provided various explanations, but the fact remained he had waited days to officially notify authorities that his wife was missing. The investigation shifted into high gear between January 8th and 10th, 2023. What had begun as a missing person case was rapidly transforming into something far more sinister. Law enforcement executed search warrants at multiple locations, including the Walshe family home and various waste disposal sites in the area. What they allegedly discovered would form the backbone of the prosecution's case. In the basement of the Cohasset home, investigators reported finding blood evidence and a knife with apparent blood staining. The discovery was significant not just for what it suggested, but for where it was found. This was not evidence easily explained away as an accident or coincidence, but the most extensive evidence recovery occurred at waste facilities and transfer stations. According to prosecutors, investigators painstakingly traced garbage collection routes and examined tons of refuse from bins near the home of Brian's mother. What emerged from this grim archaeological dig was a catalogue of items that prosecutors would argue told the story of a murder and its concealment. Among the items allegedly recovered, a hatchet, a hacksaw, towels, and linens. Tyvek protective suits matching those Brian had allegedly purchased, chemical cleaning agents, and disturbingly personal effects that belonged to Anna. A Prada handbag, boots matching the description of those she had been wearing, even her COVID-19 vaccination card. Perhaps most significant was a small bone fragment found on a handsaw. This fragment was sent for DNA analysis, though the results and their interpretation would become matters of legal debate. Without Anna's body establishing that the fragment belonged to her, and determining how it came to be on that saw required the jury to make inferences to connect dots that the defense would argue were too far apart to connect with certainty. For prosecutors, motive was an essential element to establish. Why would Brian Walshe want his wife dead? The answer they suggested could be found in financial records and the deteriorating state of the marriage. Life insurance policies totaling approximately $2.7 million listed Brian as the beneficiary. For a man facing sentencing in a federal fraud case, for a family with financial pressures, that sum represented a powerful incentive. Prosecutors also presented evidence of marital discord. Friends testified that Anna had expressed stress about the relationship, about potential relocations, about the direction her life was taking. The trial also touched on what prosecutors described as an extramarital relationship involving Anna. This detail, while not directly probative of murder, painted a picture of a marriage under strain of two people whose lives were diverging rather than intertwining. Defense attorneys would have to navigate these revelations carefully as they cut both ways. Did evidence of an affair provide Brian with motive for murder, or did it suggest Anna might have had her own reasons for disappearing? Then came a stunning development that would reshape the entire case. Brian Walshe, through his attorneys, made admissions that most defendants would never make. He acknowledged that he had concealed and dismembered a body. He admitted to disposing of remains. These were not the words of a man claiming complete innocence. But crucially, vitally, Brian did not admit to murder. His explanation, as presented by his defense team, was that Anna had died suddenly and unexpectedly while sleeping. He claimed it was a natural death, a tragic accident of biology. Confronted with his wife's lifeless body, Brian said he panicked. He did not call 911. He did not seek help. Instead, convinced that no one would believe him, terrified of the legal jeopardy he already faced in the art fraud case, he made a series of catastrophic decisions. According to this defense narrative, the internet searches, the purchases of cleaning supplies and tools, the disposal of remains, all of these actions were not the premeditated steps of a murderer, but the frantic, ill-conceived reactions of a man in crisis. It was a story of terrible judgment, of criminal concealment of lies upon lies, but not necessarily murder. The defense theory required the jury to accept a specific sequence of events. Anna dies of natural causes. Brian discovers her body. Rather than calling authorities, he convinces himself that his situation is hopeless. Already facing federal charges, already under legal scrutiny, he believes he will be blamed regardless of the truth. So he destroys evidence, disposes of the body, and creates an elaborate false narrative about her traveling to Washington. Was this story plausible? That became the central question. Could a person react to a spouse's unexpected death with such calculated deception? Or were these the actions that only made sense if there was something to hide? Something much darker than panic. The defense seized on what they characterized as the fundamental weakness of the prosecution's case, the absence of a body. Without remains, there could be no autopsy. Without an autopsy, there could be no definitive cause of death. Without a definitive cause of death, how could the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Anna Walshe was murdered rather than dying from some undiagnosed medical condition? This is where the legal concept of reasonable doubt becomes paramount. In the American criminal justice system, the burden of proof rests entirely on the prosecution. They must prove every element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense does not have to prove innocence. They merely have to create sufficient doubt. In Massachusetts, first-degree murder is defined with specificity. It requires proof of killing with malice, aforethought, with deliberate premeditation. Alternatively, it can be established if the killing occurred with extreme atrocity or cruelty, or during the commission of another serious felony. Each of these elements requires proof, and in a case without a body, that proof must come from circumstantial evidence alone. The prosecution faced a formidable challenge. They had to convince 12 jurors that the accumulation of digital evidence, purchases, witness testimony, and physical items found in trash facilities added up to proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Brian Walshe deliberately killed his wife. They had to overcome the instinctive unease many people feel about convicting someone of murder when the victim's body has never been recovered. But prosecutors also had advantages. The sheer volume of evidence, while circumstantial, created what they argued was an inescapable pattern. The internet searches were not ambiguous. They were specific and damning. The purchases were not coincidental. They formed a logical sequence. The disposal of items was not careless. It showed awareness of guilt. Most tellingly, Brian's own admissions about concealing and dismembering remains eliminated any argument that Anna was still alive somewhere, that she had simply walked away from her life. The trial itself, held in December 2025, nearly 3 years after Anna's disappearance, was a study in contrasting strategies. The prosecution called numerous witnesses, presented hundreds of pieces of evidence, and constructed a narrative that required the jury to see patterns in seemingly disparate facts. The defense made a choice that surprised some observers. They called no witnesses. Brian Walshe himself did not take the stand in his own defense. This decision is constitutionally protected. A defendant cannot be compelled to testify, and no negative inference is supposed to be drawn from silence. But in practice, juries often wonder why, if a defendant is innocent, they would not want to tell their side of the story directly. The defense's calculation appeared to be that the prosecution had failed to meet its burden. By not presenting witnesses, they avoided the risks of cross-examination, of inconsistent statements, of giving prosecutors new targets. They were in essence saying to the jury, the state must prove this case, and they have not done so with the certainty required for a murder conviction. On December 12, 2025, after both sides had rested and closing arguments had been delivered, the jury retired to begin deliberations. 12 ordinary citizens selected from the community now carried the extraordinary responsibility of determining whether Brian Walshe was guilty of first-degree murder. The questions before them were both simple and impossibly complex. First, without a body, without an autopsy, without a confirmed cause of death, how should they evaluate whether Anna Walshe was murdered? The prosecution argued that the totality of circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The defense insisted that doubt remained at every turn. Which interpretation would the jury find more credible? Second, how should the jury interpret the pattern of internet searches, purchases, and disposal activities? Were these the methodical steps of a killer trying to cover his tracks taken in the hours after committing murder? Or were they the panicked, misguided reactions of a man who discovered his wife dead and made catastrophically poor choices in response? Intent matters in murder cases. Actions that look identical can have vastly different legal meanings depending on the state of mind behind them. Third, and perhaps most philosophically challenging, where exactly does reasonable doubt lie in a case constructed entirely from inference? Every piece of evidence admitted at trial was subject to interpretation. Even Brian's admissions about concealing a body could be explained at least theoretically by his defense narrative. Was the accumulation of circumstantial evidence enough to remove all reasonable doubt? Or were there simply too many unknowns, too many alternative explanations, too many gaps that could not be definitively closed? These were not abstract legal questions. They had profound human consequences. For Anna's family, particularly her parents and siblings in Serbia, the case represented a search for justice and closure in a situation that defied both. For Brian's family, and for the couple's 3 young sons, the outcome would determine whether the children lost one parent to death, or both parents, one to death and one to life imprisonment. Beyond the immediate parties, the case resonated with broader themes that Americans recognize from countless true crime documentaries and legal dramas. It touched on questions about what we can know and how we can know it. It challenged assumptions about the nature of proof. It reminded us that real criminal cases are rarely as neat as their fictional counterparts, that evidence is often fragmentary and subject to multiple interpretations. The case also highlighted the evolution of criminal investigation in the digital age. 20 years ago, a case like this might have turned primarily on physical evidence and witness testimony. But in 2023, digital forensics played an equally crucial role. Search engine histories, geolocation, data from cell phones, surveillance, camera footage. From stores and traffic cameras, these digital traces created a record of actions and intent that would have been invisible in an earlier era. Whether that digital trail proved guilt or merely demonstrated poor judgment was the question the jury had to answer. For the community of Cohasset, the case shattered any remaining illusions about small-town safety. Violence, when it occurs in places like this, feels more shocking precisely because it contradicts the local narrative. This was supposed to be the kind of place where people raised families, where crime meant vandalism or the occasional break-in, not the disappearance and alleged murder of a mother on New Year's Day. As the jury deliberated, legal experts debated the strength of the case. Some argued that the circumstantial evidence was simply too powerful to ignore, that the combination of internet searches, purchases, disposal of items, and Brian's own admissions created an overwhelming inference of guilt. Others contended that without a body, without a definitive cause of death, the case remained inherently speculative, that it required the jury to make leaps of logic that might not survive the reasonable doubt standard. The truth, as is often the case in complex criminal trials, likely lay in the details. How credible did the jury find the defense's explanation of panic and poor judgment? How much weight did they give to the timing of the internet searches? Did they believe that the items found in the trash when taken together could only have one explanation? Were there alternative scenarios that, while perhaps unlikely, were still possible enough to constitute reasonable doubt? This case serves as a reminder that the American criminal justice system is built on principles that sometimes create tension. We want guilty people punished, but we also recognize that wrongful convictions are a profound injustice. We want closure for victims and their families, but we also protect defendants' rights rigorously. We trust juries to weigh evidence carefully, but we acknowledge that they are human beings, subject to the same cognitive biases and limitations as anyone else. In the absence of direct proof in cases where there is no confession, no eyewitness, no murder weapon directly linking a defendant to a killing. The system asks ordinary citizens to look at fragments of evidence and decide whether those fragments, when assembled, create a picture clear enough to justify stripping someone of their freedom forever. It is an awesome responsibility, one that jurors do not take lightly. Whatever verdict ultimately emerges from the jury room, the Anna Walshe case will be studied for years to come. It will be analyzed in law schools as an example of circumstantial evidence and reasonable doubt. It will be discussed in criminal justice courses as a case study in digital forensics. It will likely be featured in true crime media, each retelling emphasizing different aspects, different theories, different interpretations of the same basic facts. But beyond the legal analysis and the media coverage, there are human beings at the center of this story. Anna Walshe, a woman who came to America seeking opportunity, who built a career, who raised 3 sons, who celebrated New Year's Eve 2022 with friends and then vanished. 3 young boys who lost their mother and may lose their father as well. Families in Serbia and America grappling with grief, uncertainty, and the agonizing wait for answers. The case reminds us that justice at its best is about balancing competing values and finding truth in situations where absolute certainty may be impossible. It reminds us that the presumption of innocence and the requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt are not technicalities but fundamental protections that define our system. If you have thoughts on this case based on the facts and evidence presented, we invite you to share them in the comments below. Please keep discussions focused on the legal and factual elements rather than speculation. Subscribe to this channel for updates on the verdict when the jury reaches its decision, and for coverage of other complex criminal cases that challenge our understanding of justice, evidence, and truth.